The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents First Believe. So, as I mentioned in the last video where I was reviewing a debate I did, I'm hearing a particular type of apologetic more and more lately. And it's one that I initially found so absurd from the standpoint of a sound epistemology, sound just warranted reasons to believe. And so clearly flawed that I thought it was rare that I was hearing from individuals who just hadn't really thought through this, who didn't recognize the problems of believing first. I'm sure in the 13 and a half years that I've done the show, someone has called in and said, well, you can't see this because you need to believe first and then you will see the evidence. It's difficult for me to just not outright laugh at this over and over again. It's like, I don't understand why people don't see the problem with it. Oh, well, you won't see any evidence for the Loch Ness Monster until you first believe there's evidence for the Loch Ness Monster, and then you'll see the evidence. But it's come up several times in different forms, including in recent debates. So let's take a look at believing first. So the first thing to address is something that I've said over and over again, and I apologize to those of you who've seen all of my content because I don't know if there's going to be that much in this particular video that's going to be new for some of you, and that is belief is not a choice. And by that, what I mean is when we use the word believe normatively, we're saying we are convinced that something is the case or is likely the case. I'm reminded of the speaking event that I did with Lawrence Krauss in Toronto, where we had a slight disagreement about the usage of the word belief and faith. And I am trying to change the way I talk about this. I want to say, instead of saying, I believe the sky is blue, it may be more useful to say, I am convinced that the sky is blue. And by using that language, you can find someone who is not convinced that the sky is blue. And it may be more clear that when they say, I am not convinced the sky is blue, that they are not asserting that the sky is not blue or that it's red or whatever else. This might be more clear than saying, I believe the sky is blue, and then somebody says, I don't believe the sky is blue. Because it seems that when somebody says, I don't believe that a God exists, the assumption from people is that, oh, you're then saying God doesn't exist. Whereas if you were to say, I'm not convinced, that might be more compelling. And I believe, I don't want to misattribute this, I've tried different language surrounding this off and on for years. I believe it was Ozymandias who pointed this out to me as a potential improvement, but it could be one or two other people. I wish I'd have dug through, I can't dig through all the correspondence, but I think it might have been Ozzy. But my position is that belief is the state of accepting a proposition is true. Here's a proposition. There's a glass of iced tea on the table next to me. Actually, that statement is just a statement. It's a claim. You are either convinced that there is a glass of iced tea right there, or you are not convinced. And the shorthand language that we use for this is, I believe there's a glass of iced tea there, or I do not believe there's a glass of iced tea there. And the second one is distinctly different from, I believe there's not a glass of iced tea there. Because that is addressing a different proposition, the contrary proposition. Proposition 1 is, there is a glass of iced tea. Proposition 2 is, there is not a glass of iced tea. Rejecting the first one doesn't mean you accept the second one. But accepting the second one does mean that you reject the first one. But neither of these are instances of a choice. For me, when we talk about whether or not someone's convinced, when we talk about whether or not they believe, the position of accepting a claim, of being convinced of a claim, of believing a claim, is the result of becoming convinced. You can believe things for good reasons or bad reasons, but you become convinced of everything. Now, you can become convinced very simply and easily. For example, if I say there's a tiny notepad and a pencil, sitting on the table here next to me. You might be just convinced based on my word. That doesn't mean that you're accepting something on faith. It doesn't mean that you're behaving in an irrational sense. It may be that you went really quickly in your mind, well, I know that pads of paper and pencils exist. I generally found Matt to be particularly trustworthy. It also makes sense that he might have a pencil and paper there to take notes when he's recording videos. And so and then also that there's nothing to risk in accepting this proposition. I don't have to change my view about the world. I don't have to change my view about Matt. And if it turns out that I'm wrong, I haven't really risked that much because, it's not going to impact my life greatly if it turns out there's not a thing there. So you could be reasonably convinced based merely on somebody's word if the nature of the claim is mundane. This is why we talk about extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I said, that there was a magical notepad over there that I could think a thought and it would just appear on the notepad, now all of a sudden we have a fundamentally different type of claim, and I don't see how you could reasonably be justified in accepting that claim based merely on my say-so. You would need supporting evidence. This is what tends to confuse people. We realize that we can do this, that somebody can just say something and it feels to us as if we immediately believe it. Hi, my name's Matt. Okay, I just accept that. Hi, my name's Joe. Okay, I just accept that. Hi, my name's 11. Hang on, that's a little more unusual, but I've heard stuff like this, and I'll just accept it because it's easier to take your word. These thought processes happen, but we're not always conscious of it. If there's a goal to critical thinking and skepticism, it is to train your intuition, to train your brain so that the heuristic that it follows when it's presented with a claim is as reliable as it can be and is as efficient as it can be. So that when somebody claims, I was talking to my psychic the other day, woo, alarm bells are going off. Whereas when they say I was talking to my sister the other day, there's no alarm bells. Training your bullshit detector, for lack of a better phrase. But belief isn't a choice. It's not like you decide, I am going to believe this, as if that action is what results in you accepting it. As a matter of fact, given what we know about neuroscience, even the act of saying, I am going to believe this, is most likely a rationalization of the fact that you do, in fact, accept it. You may not understand the reasons you accept it, and so you're just going to state that you accept it as if that would make it so. Boom. I'm going to accept this claim. For the people who think that belief is a choice, I know JT and others have been, like, hey, walk to the edge of the building and believe that gravity doesn't work and take a step off and stuff like that. There's lots of different ways to explain this. But in a nutshell, even if belief was a choice, that's a separate issue from whether or not that belief is warranted. And in both cases of becoming convinced of something for bad reasons, choosing to believe something, even if it were possible, may in and of itself be a bad reason. So this idea that you could potentially choose your belief is one that I reject. We can set that aside and talk about it another time. Because what we're talking about here is this idea that if you believe first, then you will begin to see the evidence for the claim. Specifically, this comes up surrounding God claims. And you know what? They're absolutely right. Except that doesn't change whether or not your belief is justified, and it doesn't change whether or not the evidence that you are seeing, and I put that in scary air quotes for those who are listening, actually should bolster your belief. The problem here is that if you begin by believing something, and then you explore the world with that belief, it creates a bias. We've talked about this with regard to the resurrection debate with Mike Lacona. If you believe that a God exists and can do anything, then when you find things in the world that are unexplained, this garbage can lid moved, I don't have a natural explanation for it, but God would serve as an explanation, and I already believe the God thing, so now that gets credited to God. And it does double duty on the damage, because this experience, which should be properly listed as we do not have an explanation for this, we now act as if it has an explanation because we already believed in the God thing. And the God thing, which doesn't have sufficient justification for it, now gets one more data point of things in God's favor. Oh, if I begin by believing in God, then whenever I pray and something happens, I attribute that to God. Oh, God said yes. Oh, God said no. Well, now both potential outcomes from a prayer actually get filed away as one more point in favor of the God belief that I started with. And now I have explanations for these things that are potentially unexplained. This is almost a conscious act of self-deception, except that I don't believe that people are quite as aware of it as perhaps they should be. When I talk about critical thinking skepticism, one of the foundational things to training your internal heuristic is to do whatever you can to remove your biases. This is why science is the single most consistently reliable mechanism we have for accurately modeling reality. The reason that we have so much confidence in science isn't merely because it continues to produce useful answers, predictive explanations. It doesn't make proclamations about truth, but it seems to provide us with consistent, reliable, accurate models of reality and explanations for things. It's not merely the results of science. It is that we have a good understanding and trust in a method that begins with, we need to remove as much bias from this as possible. We know that we're human beings. We know that we're flawed. We know that we are going to tend to see the results we want. If you go out looking for a connection between two things, the odds of you finding it are increased whether there's a connection between those two or not. It's the exact same thing that fuels the conspiracy theorist mindset. If there's a secret cabal of the government out to get you, then anything that might fit, that is consistent with that preconceived notion, acts as evidence for it, even though it shouldn't. And the conspiracy theorist model is very similar to the religious model. Because if you, as I said before, if you pray and you get what you're looking for, you seem to get what you're looking for, boom, God said yes. And if you don't, God said no. Either way, it's a credit to God. You watch the conspiracy theorists and you know, someone begins to investigate a connection between, you know, it's the Illuminati is controlling everything. And if you investigate and you find no evidence that they're in the Illuminati, and they say, no, of course I'm not in the Illuminati. Well, somebody in the Illuminati would definitely say that they are not in the Illuminati. And this gets used as yet one more positive point towards the conspiracy theory, because you've begun with a belief. Instead of following the evidence where it leads, people are advocating for beginning with a conclusion and trying to make the evidence fit. And there's no end to the sort of things that you can seemingly justify if you do that. So how then, I was going to say how, if this is so obvious, is it also so popular? Because it doesn't just live within religion. It lives, as I was pointing out, within the conspiracy theorists and a number of other things where I'm convinced that this person is a terrible person. And once I have that notion, everything they do and say is filtered through that lens of what I already think of them. How does that actually get us closer to the truth, rather than just engaging in the sort of confirmation bias, so that our assessment of individuals or actions is always colored by what we already thought about the person? Oh, this is a good person, so I'm going to listen more charitably to them. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt more often. I think I know why this happens, and why it's both a good thing and an absolutely terrible thing. So without getting into a deep philosophical discussion about what is truth and is there any truth, I have tended to go with kind of like the confirmation model of truth, where truth is that which comports with reality. If the facts of the reality bear out what we understand to be true, then that's what true is. I don't have a view of ultimate truth and this other kind of impassioned view of, there's a capital T truth, blah, blah, blah. I'm mainly viewing things as science and skepticism would have us view, which is we're going to come up with the best explanations that are most consistent with the evidence once we remove as much bias as we can. This is something that you would hope would be obvious to everybody, but it's not. And so the first lie, the first deception, the first false bias that we tend to have is that people do care about what is true. There are certainly people who do, and there are people who don't. And in both of those camps, you can further subdivide that into people who have a good understanding of how to come up with reliable models of reality, and people who don't. There are people who care about truth who have very little understanding of how one could possibly go about finding it. And there are people who don't care about truth who, it seems to me, do have a pretty good understanding of how you'd go about it. They just are more in favor of comfort. And in everyday life, I don't have to sit around, and I don't have the time to sit around and evaluate every single component of every person's character that I ever interact with. We take the short route. We make generalizations. Hey, all of my interactions with this person have been good and positive. So when somebody else tells me, oh, you can't trust that person, they're a sociopath and they'll stab you in the back and they're talking crap about you behind your back, I have to take that in and process it and say, their experience with this person may be different. Getting to the realization that your experience of reality beyond interpersonal relationships may also be different and may also be colored by your perceptions and interactions shouldn't be that difficult. Some people like broccoli and some people don't. And this experience colors their perception of everything related to broccoli and perhaps even goes beyond that. There are people who have food preferences based entirely on texture and not taste, and others who prioritize texture over taste and taste over texture. So if we've got these biases, and people would say, first you need to believe and then you see the evidence. And I can see how this is an incredible problem. Why is it that other people don't? Well, because it works. Lying to yourself works. Having a bias works, right up to the point where it doesn't. If I generally view people as good, and I'm more inclined to give them a bit of the doubt, that changes the nature of our relationship and may in fact mean that they're generally a better person when they're around us. People also act differently around different individuals. Set aside the personal stuff. How does this work with evidence? Because evidence doesn't have some desire to fit in or, fool us. Well, if you begin with the idea that there's a God, then all of a sudden things that might otherwise and perhaps should be listed as unexplained now seem to have an explanation, and you bolster the idea of God. And until such time as this causes a problem, until there's a clear conflict between your understanding of what is real and what's actually real, there's not much incentive to change your mind. There's not much incentive to even begin to suspect that the biases that you brought into, the baggage that you brought into this examination of the world, of God, of whatever, is actually affecting it. You think that you're being fair. You think that you're being reasonable. Generally, people don't think they're unreasonable. Generally, people don't think they're wrong. This is why I talked before about the difference between feeling like you're right. Everybody feels like they're right, because when you find out that you're wrong, you're faced with this clear problem, and you've got to find a way to rationalize it, or you get rid of the bad beliefs. And as human beings, we're incredibly good at rationalizing. This plays right into the conspiracy theorist model. It plays right into the religious model. oh, well, we know God cares about us, then why is there so much seemingly unnecessary suffering? And not even just suffering that is, the hands of men. Why are there, cancer and hurricanes and stuff like that? Well, God knows better than us and he has a plan. He sees farther than us, so his understanding of morality and reality far exceed ours, and we should just trust that this is what's in our best interest. This is precisely what somebody's doing when they say, first you need to believe, and then you will see the evidence. Because within Christianity in particular, within, traditional biblical notions, there are passages where, God gives people over to reprobate minds, or people are closed-hearted. And so if you can portray a reasonable, impartial, unbiased individual as if they actually have a bias against your position, that is the best way to rationalize what you've done. For clarity, if I begin with a belief that a God exists, and I come by this belief for bad reasons, whether it's a choice, which I reject the idea that it's a choice, let's just say that I don't really have good reasons. Because if I had good reasons, I would just offer those reasons and they would be compelling. And I would never have to appeal to faith, and I would never have to say, first you need to believe, and then you can justify it. So I've got a belief in a God, and it's unwarranted. There's not good justification for it. But then I start exploring the world, and I find things that I don't have explanations for. So now God becomes those explanations, and as we talked about, it makes the unexplained seem explained, and it bolsters this idea that there's a God. And I keep doing this. Well, because the position is essentially unfalsifiable, and because I'm taking positives and negatives and using them both as positives, it just cycles this belief up to where it's stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And then I come across somebody like me, somebody who does not believe and who begins to challenge the reasons that I give for believing. If I were to honestly and fairly engage with this person, I would have to begin to accept that I have been engaged in flawed reasoning, that I've accepted things that I shouldn't, that I have attributed causality without justification. Oh, I prayed and the cancer went away, therefore it must have been God. Instead of, okay, I prayed and, I took my chemo and radiation treatment and the cancer went away, and therefore we have an explanation. Oh, well, this person wasn't on chemo and radiation. We found, a case where cancer went into remission. Yes, cancer goes into remission. Where's the justification for claiming it's God? Well, we have to have an explanation. And this is something that I saw in my most recent debate, where this arrogant idea that we seem to have that we've been in the world long enough, studying the world long enough, that we deserve and should have an explanation for anything and everything right now. And this builds up the idea that you're justified in believing in God. And if you can point to skeptics and say, oh, yes, they think they're being reasonable, but skeptics, they're just closed-minded. There's nothing you could say that would ever convince them. This serves as yet another foolproof data point for the belief that you want to hold. But it doesn't tell you anything about whether or not that belief's justified. And so when somebody says believe first, you have to have that conversation of, hang on, what if I told you that first you need to believe that white people are superior to black people, and then you'll see the evidence for it? What if I told you that first you need to believe that men are superior to women, and then you would see the evidence for it? What if I told you that first you need to believe that gravity doesn't work, and then you would see the evidence for it? Build up from things that they already reject to show that the methods they're using don't produce or should not produce the beliefs that they hold. That this is not a rational method for determining what's true. And if in fact there was a God, the time to believe it is after you've been presented sufficient evidence for it. And anytime someone's telling you that you should believe first in order to see the evidence, alarm bells should be going off. not just because it's a bad method for determining what is true and real, but if they're talking about a God, there's no way that an all-knowing, wise creator of everything would not be familiar with how horrible a method this is for reaching the truth. Imagine that you're God and you have created all of this and you want people to know that you exist and understand it. Why on earth would you ever create a system where the most valuable, the most beneficial method of reaching this conclusion is to begin with belief and then do the post hoc examination afterwards? Why wouldn't you just interact with people? Why wouldn't you present clear evidence? Oh, that passage in Romans talking about how the invisible things of his nature are made clear so that we were without excuse, etc., paraphrasing. When you look at the methods that religious holy books and religious apologists are advocating for how to come to belief, these are almost in every single scenario the exact opposite of what we should do to come by a reasonably justified belief. Believe first. Nope, that's bias. That colors your perception of everything else. The most reliable method to understanding the truth attempts to remove as much bias and confusion as possible. It puts evidence first. No matter how strongly I want to believe that sugar is good for me because it tastes good, the evidence shows that sugar is essentially poisonous to me as a diabetic. If I just said, nope, I don't believe the scientists, nope, I don't believe the evidence, I have a belief that God has put us here as stewards of the planet, and therefore there's nothing we could do to hurt the planet, which means climate change must be a hoax and not anthropogenic. Maybe it was invented by the Chinese, maybe what. It's easy to begin with a belief and then structure a worldview that protects it, as long as you're not in any way concerned about good methods of figuring out the best understanding of reality. Believing first is completely backward. And as soon as somebody says it, no matter how difficult it is, try not to laugh and try to get them to understand that under no other circumstances would they be willing to accept a proposition first and then try to find the evidence after. Would they want to walk into a courtroom where they had to prove their innocence? I hope not. We'll see you next time. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.